Thanks everyone for joining us. We've got a good number in attendance. And today we're going to be talking about a really difficult topic of making difficult decisions. Now we have difficult decisions to deal with every day of our lives. We find them very difficult to manage in a very different way to the way they might be in a personal environment. The rules are different within your family environment, for example, or friends. You have a different degree of latitude and you can make different kinds of decisions. But obviously when you're sitting in a business environment, people tend to behave differently. Now, interesting, I don't know if any of you have done the moral DNA test, which often indicates that you are a very different person in your home life to what you are in your business life when you do that test. And there's certain of the 8, I think it is, where very seldom are you the same in both your personal and your business life, which gives you a sort of indication that we do have different responses and different behaviors. I mean, you think some people are bullies at home or mice at home and the opposite at work. You know, we do see that this kind of activity does happen. So what I want to cover today is the difficulty of making decisions. So what have we done over the last 3 weeks? We've covered this issue of influence and bias. And we talked in the last weeks about the fact that we are human. We are going to be biased by various agendas and various things that are going on around us of various different natures. We are all either to a degree the System 1, fast thinkers, people who can think on the spot, who can respond to an environment with clarity successfully. Then you have the System 2 thinkers who need time to think, time to respond to a certain circumstance. Some people, for example, in a board meeting, when they receive information for the first time, might not be able to deal with it. You walk to the finance director's office and you give them a whole new solution to a problem that you're all dealing with, and the response might be that is not in a position to be able to think that through. You're all ready to talk about it. They might not be. They might have to do some serious thinking of their own before that they're going to be able to respond and need time to reflect, consider, and weigh up the pros and cons of this decision you've seen. We are biased. We've been through a whole bunch of the biases and we've gone through that in quite a bit of detail. Metacognitive being the one where we think we are not biased, which we all have recognized we are. We then looked at various tips and tricks to stop us making these biased influence decisions in an inappropriate manner. So that is the area that we're going to also have a look at. Decision making, one thing I think we have to understand is that we're all very different. Because we're different, we're going to respond to that stimuli in that external environment very differently. The outcomes we want to get to are going to be different, one person to another. But equally, the appetite for the journey is going to be different between one of us and another of us as to how we're going to do it. Some of us will stand back and let the steam cool off, and others will delve in there in the middle of the hot fire. Yeah, we'll all do things differently because that's how we are wired, and we have to accept that. We did cover understanding the opponent, the opposite person, the other side of the conversation, the alternatives, and know them well so that you can navigate your journey successfully. Being mindful of others, making sure you do understand yourself. And if you understand yourself, you can check yourself when you need to, because that is important. We covered the cognitive codex of 180 biases and went, oh my God, let's just accept I've got them and respond to them appropriately. We then also looked at the 27 that we think we're most likely to see in business. And what I will do is we will send out an image to you in the next 24 hours or so with the thank you letter of putting those into some business boxes, which I've not seen done, as to how those might impact you from a business perspective. And then we had the RAP model, which picked up a couple of other different approaches as to how we can create that distance and that strategic looking back or onto the environment that we are faced with to try and take the emotion out of it. When we say take the emotion out of it, what we're actually doing is taking out the bias and influence. So we've covered a lot already, guys, about half what we would cover in a lesson, ICSA lesson. So there's your codex which had the 4 quadrants where people are dealing with too much information. It doesn't mean enough to me. I can't act this quickly. And I've got to try and absorb all this data. There's so much content that I'm trying to deal with. And how am I meant to work out what is important and what is relevant? So that brings us now to today. What are we going to cover today? Probably the pinnacle and the most difficult thing we are asked to do in our business day job is to make decisions about people, whether that's the boardroom, whether that's staff, whether that's employing people, all sorts of things. And we're just going to go through a couple of examples that we see in our day jobs to just give you some idea of how complex those can be. And then I'd like to just have a conversation amongst us where we can either ask me, what would you do in the case of, or give us an example of where something has occurred in your story you would like to share and how that has delivered either a good or bad outcome. So these were the 27 biases that we looked at, which have all got a business point. I'm not going to go through them. You've got them, you've seen them. We're going to just talk about some of these in the conversations we're going to have now. The next 9 that I came across, because I think they are quite important from a business perspective, the ones that influence the way people behave, and have very much a similar influence. There are a lot of these across, if you look at these, a lot of the ones, even if you look within the Codex, how many of them are actually the same? So they're probably half the number in actual reality. I've got different words for some, very much of the same thing. That too difficult bias, that one. Somebody said to me over the weekend, what is happening about X? And I just said, it's on my too difficult list. It's on the other person's too difficult list. So don't expect anything to happen. We do know when it's the right time to deal with something and when it's not the right time. So very specifically, this is something that we're looking at, needed to consider. But if you actually look at it, is right now, another way of looking at it is, my gut feeling now is not the right time to approach it because it's going to become a mission. Whereas, well, leave it 2 weeks and the sun is warmer or whatever reason is out there, actually this job will become quite normal and quite manageable and acceptable to the other individual. So there's no point me trying to deal with it now because I'm going to waste a lot of energy. So that's an example where listening to your instincts, listening to yourself, knowing the other people, this is the case, is knowing the other person and saying, actually, they are not ready for this conversation now. So I'm not going to waste my time. I know you might want it, and I know I want it, but the person who's going to have to do it is not going to get it done. So let's all just have a calm process, and we'll get it done in a week or a month's time or whatever it might be. Obviously, we all have this just in time. Eventually, there are things that you have to get done, and we all get them done usually by that time. So one of the things I wanted to go through a couple of examples of difficult decisions and how you could potentially approach them. Now, one of the things we learned is in the tricks of the trade that we discussed earlier in the lessons was to break down the decision into its component parts. So let's take, for example, a senior independent director, been around for ages, and let's take it through a board evaluation. This individual is seen not to be fit for purpose and is causing the board to operate at a very slow speed, creating an environment of the 1950s, 1990s style of boardroom environment. And it's an all-male environment. It's very hierarchical. It's much like that Bank of England example we saw a couple of weeks back. And that person is staunched into that scenario. They're due to retire in 18 months' time. And the evaluator has said, fit for purpose, no longer fit for the environment. We've just been through COVID. The This person has not adapted to the speed of which we've had to operate. They're not able to make the frequency of meetings that are needed, doesn't understand why we have to consider the stakeholder as much as we're doing. We see this as a waste of money. And the evaluator has said, I think this person should be moved on ahead of their 18 months. And the chairman goes, I'm not telling him that. And you think, well, strange response. I thought you would want the best board possible, that you'd want the board that is going to engage the most effectively in the future, because we've got so many more challenges ahead of us. And then the conversation starts, and it'll go along the lines of, he won't actually say it, but he's a friend of mine. He's one of my ilk. He's one of my clan. He's part of the system. He's been around ages. And what he's trying to say is he's a man of same age, same makeup that I am. And we've worked on this board together for 7.5 years. And he is the SID, so therefore he has a role. And therefore, in my view, the reaction that the chairman has is that will be the end of our friendship if I have to have this conversation. So the correlation between the role was best for the company and me, myself, my friendship, and the fact is I don't want to broach the conversation, immediately puts this whole thing into, well, this is in the too difficult box before we even got past base one. So how would you approach that as a board evaluator to help the individual get through that process? So there are a couple of things. Is you can abdicate and get someone else to do it. So, okay, that becomes me, and I walk in and I end up having to have the conversation, or at least get the grounding for the conversation to come. The other thing is to actually now look at breaking up the conversation into a few parts. First part will be feedback. Feedback will identify certain issues. The next stage of it is, how is that individual going to step up to that mark? So in the process of their assessment as a director, you can approach certain objectives, outcomes, behaviors, engagements that you expect. You're not saying, and if you don't, we're going to fire you. That's not what you're saying. But what you're creating is an environment that you could say is, maybe we should change roles, and then you look to move them from SID to director, and you bring the SID in that the board evaluator has said is a person on the board that is more suitable for the job. So you're still important, you're still part of it, we'll be doing a succession. So you change it into a succession conversation. What you can also do is say, for your last 18 months, we can make you vice chair, and we can bring in a senior independent director, because it's a stakeholder relationship that this individual is incapable of managing. So you can change their relationship to the board, and in that way, by changing the relationship, you can also change the way they behave. But if you leave them in the role, they're not going to change, because they're going to do everything as they did it. So you have to get somebody in new to do the stakeholder conversation. So can you see the kinds of things that we've started to engage? But you take the person on the journey. You respect them as a human. But what you have also done in the process of that exercise is worked out what are the consequences if you don't do it. Now, that is a difficult one, because you don't know, you've not been there, you can't see it, but somebody else can. So that's where you use the outside intel to support, saying these are the kind of things that can go wrong if we don't take this decision now. And then it's for the board actually to assess, are those important enough to actually take this difficult decision? Yeah, you might find that the perfect is not necessary. I can deal with not perfect. There's nothing wrong with that. I think you're mad, but you know, it is important to stay mindful of what's coming in from the outside. If I take another example and we look at a chairman who keeps crossing the line into the executive space. I've seen it in a number of industries, all sorts of industries. Now, this can be because there's an ineffective CEO, or they are knowledgeable in the industry. It's in their DNA to be authoritative and directive in nature. There could be a whole bunch of reasons why. There could be that there's a problem and they don't trust the person. Relationship has broken down dramatically. But the board have now come to the decision, in whatever reason they've got there, that this chairman is no longer the right chairman for the business. And it's the chairman that's causing the problem, not the CEO or whatever. And they feel it's beyond repair. Now, that would have taken a lot of socializing and a lot of work and a lot of effort for the board to have collectively come to a decision that something needs to be done. Okay, so that's the first part of your journey, and a very difficult part of the journey. Now you come to the next part of the journey where we actually have to do something about it. What are we actually going to do? And then everyone goes, let's just sweep it under the carpet for another week. Can we just not talk about it now? I'm really busy. I know I do all these delaying tactics myself. I'm good at them. I love delaying tactics because my mind gets used to what it needs to do and it has time to absorb it. So when you get to open your mouth to have that conversation, it actually becomes quite an easy one. And never try and do it in the emotion of it. So there you've got a number of considerations, and you can give them quantitative evidence, qualitative evidence. You can have a man-to-man conversation, and the person will say, don't worry, chap, you're a great mate, I'll resign. Or they'll dig their heels in and make it absolutely impossible. But more often than them digging their heels in, it's more often the approach to the difficult issue is not done. It usually stalls and doesn't actually get there. So the person doesn't even get the chance to dig their heels in. So it's making sure that that journey follows right the way through, if that is what is right for the business. So it's always assessing that. And when you have that conversation, we've talked about this in many areas, is stay unemotional, stay factual, and take things in the steps and stages that we're looking at. What is going to be important to this person? Sit in their shoes. We talked about the preemptive, looking from the future backwards. Another thing is put yourself into that person's shoes. What they're going to say to their partner, what are they going to say to their best mate when they go and play golf? What's it going to do to their bank balance? How's their ego going to respond? And how are you going to handle it that they leave there feeling proud? Or have you literally cut them off at the knees? What have you actually done to them? How have you handled them in a humane way? So usually when you get to this kind of conversation, most people are not stupid. Most people have realized actually what's coming. Not always, absolutely not always. But I'd say that you're somewhere around 60-odd%. So with more than a Brexit vote in favor, people are likely to have an inkling of an issue that is arising, that is a problem between parties. So then it's taking that person on a journey. And sometimes it might be a number of interviews, a number of conversations. And also a lot of the things you've got to take into account is if any of these things cross employment law, what are the employment law issues? Ensure that when you're doing a difficult people person, have your facts first. You can talk about it, socialize it, begin the journey. But when you're getting to the crunch of the matter, you need to get all those facts in place first so that you feel that you own the space. You own the knowledge, you own the action, you own the outcome. If any of those pieces you doubt, they'll know it straight away. And so will your mind. And it'll play horrible tricks on you. So please ensure that you have your facts. A lazy chairman, I use the word lazy, but something that's not wrong. They haven't done anything wrong. There's been no fraud. They haven't not read the papers. They haven't not chaired the meeting, but they haven't actually done anything. A really difficult one. And now you want to have that conversation that it's time for another energy to come in. Most people would be mortified if the conversation is that they've not performed to their peak when they think they are. So a very difficult conversation around what is your outcome and how much do you not need to say? Because actually, sometimes you don't have to launder the washing. You really, really don't have to, particularly the dirty washing. You don't have to do it. You can be really one-to-one human with the individual about reaching the outcome without creating harm and personal harm. So it's a really important part in the decision. Everyone is a human being. They've got to go home. They've got to live with themselves. You want to help them through whatever it is they're in, so that the next step in their lives, they can mend and be a better person from this experience. So that is an important part in the difficult decision making, is that you actually are a good person in the process yourself. You might get a circumstance where you've got a disruptive need. I was working with one guy in the financial services sector, and often he would take conversations off at a tangent that had nothing to do with the meeting. There was another one, another NED that I was involved in, who knew the answer to everything, including the finance director's information, the lawyer's information, mortgage people's information, marketing information. Didn't matter what question another NED asked, that NED answered everything. The net result, it disempowered the entire executive and disempowered the entire board, who stopped asking questions, because I don't want you to answer. I remember on one occasion, one of the NEDs turned around, actually one of the female NEDs turned around to this guy and said, I've asked 3 questions and none of them were to you, sir. Do you mind if the finance director is given a chance to answer the question? Because I think he might know the answer. Yeah, they had got so annoyed, very politely, and of course the person hadn't a clue what they were doing. They were so part of the place. They had worked there, or as a NED, for so long that they knew everybody and knew the place inside out. And that is not helpful if you're holding the executive to account. So once again, the decision needed to be made. The board didn't remove that one, for example, in that case, and didn't curtail him. They just felt that that was okay. And they lived with it. They lived with the situation and said, that's fine. That's the way we're going to be. And they did lose the finance director. So what are the consequences of not taking decisions? What was more important to that organization? Was it the NED or was it the finance director? But any discussion with that, with the chairman on that conversation, even when identified and recognized, would not accept that that person would, oh, he's been here so long, he'll never leave. Careful, he might, and then watch. Oh, well, a dime a dozen anyway, really doesn't matter. That is not the way you treat your staff, with that disrespect, because you think a NED is more important than a staff member. They are equally important for different reasons, and that needs to be handled. If you look at another one we had, where we had a disruptive executive, where the executive's view was that the board was a nuisance, and I wish they weren't here and had nothing to do with me. I'd be a much happier chappie if the board weren't here. And that person would constantly use negative body language throughout a board meeting. This is one of the reasons why, and I have spoken about this in a previous conversation, is to minimize the amount of extras in a board meeting. Because the more extras you have, the more blockages there is to the conversation, and the more likely people won't speak up, because there's too many others and they'll be spoken down, and there's too much noise and everyone's coming at it. And especially in a Zoom environment, because the ability to manage it, short of cutting people off or muting them, people will just speak out, and they'll speak over one another in a way that in a room, people are genuinely usually a bit more respectful of each other and of the physical person's there. So I'm not going to talk over them quite as easily as you might do in a Zoom environment. So a disruptive executive in this case was far worse in the room than not in the room. So the decision needed to be taken by that board of, did you have these 5 executives in every board meeting attending throughout the entire board meeting? So when I asked each one, do you enjoy going? Well, at least that's one way I know what's going on. I said, but you sit there and you say nothing for 4-5 hours. Isn't there a better thing to do than doing that every single month? You know, surely you can gain that intel in a far more effective way through a chief exec and finance director feedback session, for example. So once again, there was the decision that needed to be made, because it was around people. They all wanted to be in the board because that was important, because that gave their ego the world of positivity. But what was right for the company was to take 5 people out and make a tiny room slightly more bearable, but equally to make the conversation possible. So, but that was the chairman didn't want to know about it at all. I've seen circumstances where they've had head of subsidiaries in the boardroom, and you've had 15 people in the boardroom. And you're going to now have a conversation, strategic conversation about what is right for this business. And you can have those people in for their contribution, but now you want to debate, are we going to go A route, B route, C route? That involves these people. You need to get them out the room so that you can actually have a strategic conversation. And yes, their egos might not like it. It is a people decision, but you need to do it. CEOs that are not engaging, we can go through all sorts of issues there. I worked with an organization who had a CEO who behaved like a senior process clerk rather than a CEO. But the board would not ask this man to move on because he was well known in the industry. It wouldn't have been appropriate. And he's part of the furniture. He came in here at a junior position. He's worked his way up. They wouldn't do it. When they got their mind around it, and I said, hold on, you as a board are causing half the problem. You have to let go and let the CEO fly. Well, he won't, he'll sink. I said, well, then you need a new CEO. And fortunately, the CEO was getting the message through the board evaluation process, through some very clever sowing of seeds I was doing. And before we finished, he announced he would leave in 6 months' time. He could see it coming. He realized what was wrong, and he was big enough, man enough, and the right kind of person in his DNA to do what was right by the organization. So that's just a couple of examples that we can cover. I can go on forever on examples. Another big one is around employing and asking people to leave. Big people decisions. How do you actually work out if that person is the right person? And people can be absolutely perfect on the face and be rogues underneath, and vice versa. People can be very quiet in an interview and actually excel when they get into the job. So this process that people tend to go through these days of doing some form of psychometric or people testing, understanding of what kind of, how they're driven, how they're wired, definitely helps you understand the person you've got in front of you, because people can act. Actors get on a stage, they're capable of being actors. People can come in front of you and be actors. People can come into the boardroom and be actors and not be the real people they should be. So in finishing, I would just like to sort of look at some of those difficult people matters we've talked about and just highlight on what is important. First of all, we know it's not easy. And the person it's not easy on most is you, because you are having to initiate it. So only deal with it when you are ready, because otherwise you are going to make a mess of the exercise. So you need to be prepared. You need to have thought it through. You need to have recognized the consequences of not doing it and doing it, and understood that this is the right thing to do. And if it's the wrong thing to do, don't do it. But if it's the right thing for the organization, and you've done all your testing and you've tripped yourself up with all the tripwires possible, the 12 questions and the RAP test, you've looked at the typical biases you are prone to, you've thought about it, you've dreamt about it, and eventually you get to the point saying, I have to now step over that line and do it. But what you have effectively done is broken this down into lots of small decisions. And you've looked and weighted the decisions and the outcomes as to what is right for the organization and what is the cost to anybody or anything or the organization in the process. There is no right answer to any difficult person decision. There isn't a right answer. We will get it wrong to a degree most of the time. But if we get it right, the degree of wrong will happen frequently, but it must be small. The degree of right and doing the right thing is the important part, and being able to hold your own head high in the process of knowing that when you got that new chairman in, that complete lifting of that wet blanket occurs almost instantly with the new energy, new vibrancy. When the new SID comes in, that new SID says, the most important thing is the welfare of our people going through COVID, and No, I never come from an HR environment, but I recognize the value of our people. All of a sudden, your people will start to behave differently. So getting through that difficult decision and getting the right hire, difficult person decision number 2, engaging and inducting them properly, difficult process to manage effectively, you are going to have a completely different energy. The intended outcomes are far more powerful than you feeling that you don't want to deal with the difficult decision and you are feeling sorry for yourself to have to get through that difficult process. You need to work your way through, knowing that it's not personal, not vindictive, not judgmental. You are doing what is right for whatever, and sharing that with the other individual without the laundry being utilized if you don't need to. Always take your time. Give yourself time to think, use your instincts, let those kick in. Speak about the topic, if you can, in a way and with a sounding board, even if it is literally just talking to your phone. Talk it, hear it, listen. The mirror actually sometimes responds to. Actually, put your own Zoom on and go and chat to Zoom. And also get to the point that you are calm about the issue and that you are therefore owning the reins, owning the seat, the shoes, the saddle, whatever it is that you're in, and you're in the driving seat. So when you get to that position, that is when you're ready to deal with the issue. You are not ready when you've just been thrown off the horse and trying to get back on again. That is not the time to do it because you are not going to get through it very successfully. And the important thing is, if you look at that, if you think of a fuse wire with a bomb that's going to go off at the end of the fuse wire, knowing what the damage can be of not doing it, please do it in time before it goes off, because we all know it's easy to hope. We are these internal optimists. What are the biases that we are? We don't like to take a negative decision. We always hope that the implications won't transpire. We're always positive thinking that it'll just go away, it will evaporate. But what sometimes we have to accept is those things don't just fizzle away. They actually do build up, and then they explode. And the damage to people then is far higher. But a lot of people will hide behind that smokescreen and say, well, I didn't do it. That was the circumstances. That was the circumstance, A, B, and C happening. It wasn't my decision. I didn't hurt anybody directly. You did. You absolutely did. You harmed the whole company and stakeholders by not being capable of having a backbone and doing what was right and getting on with the right decisions. So it's very important to actually determine that you need to do it. One of the things you may do in this exercise is bring in an ally with you, a running mate who can work with you, and together you are stronger as a unit, if that works. Now, for some people, that will work. Others, it will derail them completely. They need to own it and they need to control it themselves because it's so difficult. And when something is difficult and the opposing party is strong, the two together might sometimes fall apart. They might not be strong enough to hold together. So just be careful when you bring in a running mate. It's very, very strong and powerful if it works. But if it's a match not made in heaven for the purpose, it may send you on the slide, the sort of the journey you were hoping you weren't going to go on to. So what we've learned now in the last 40 minutes is that we will all respond to a circumstance that involve any form of decision differently, but particularly when there are people decisions. We do not like to hurt other human beings. We do form associations that are so subtle and so not visible, but so part of what influences and biases our decision making. And I've often told a story where we had a CEO and a chairman where it felt the balance was wrong between the leadership. And it took a long time to work out why it was the wrong way around. I mean, one was chairman, one was CEO, but it didn't feel like that was the way they were behaving. And these two gentlemen in the Freemason world, their roles were reversed. And when we determined that, I could understand what it was and therefore could handle it and get them both back into the power seats they belonged to. But they were deferring to the other role, taking control and deferring to the other role. Now that might be in the tennis club, it might be in a livery company, it might be in the rugby field. It could, all sorts of team or relationships that are outside the organization can equally impact and influence you. And here was an example of how those people had responded. And the difficult decision we had to go through was helping them both identify it without it looking like there's no respect for the body that they were belonging to, which, I mean, from a Freemason's point of view, I have no problem. But it had to be done in a completely neutral way. So I had that difficult people decision that I needed to address with full respect, but yet behavior had to change. So that's probably all I wanted to add to today, was try and give you some stories of things I've seen. You've got all the tricks and the tools and the models that can help us to just stop us to think, but given you some examples of where we've actually had to deal with it. And quite often people will say to me, but you're not doing anything. I said, no, I'm not yet. It's wrong. Time will come. It might be Monday, it might be next week, but the moon's in the wrong place, whatever. You know, there's a time and a place for everything to be done successfully. So it's understanding too, amongst yourself, your colleagues, and the problem. Are you procrastinating? Or are you socializing it, coming to that ownership position? Are you getting to that calm place? Are you getting your facts together? Those things sometimes can take 2 seconds. More often than not, it's into tomorrow. Very seldom does something that blows up now get dealt with today. Because you need, even if you're a fast thinking person, you need to calm down. Particularly if there's a human involved, because they are probably in 10 times worse position than you are. An example here, an overactive chair, nice way of putting it. I call it interfering, crossing the line, getting into the weeds, who are setting the CEO aside in his work. You know how many times I've seen this? And I just think of 4 board evaluations that come to mind immediately in fairly large organizations where the chairman was either directive, knew more, was quite autocratic in style, and the analogy I used is, if you cage an animal, it'll come out vicious. It'll come out biting, fighting. If you threaten it, you push it in a corner all the time. A bird is never going to learn to fly if you cut its wings. Yeah, all these things, you need to let that person be what they are. Trust them and support them to achieve. If they can't, you change them, in which case we now have to deal with the difficult decision. Now, is the chairman the wrong one, or is the CEO the wrong one? And my answer there is, that's where the board needs to come together. So in this difficult people decision, the board must determine, where's the problem, who's the problem, and is a departure one of the solutions, or is there another solution in between that will fix this problem? And there might be a journey of those till eventually one of them needs to go. Sometimes those journeys fix it. Sometimes those journeys are just, you're never going to change the leopard spots. They're going to stay the same all the time. What bias do you bring to the boardroom table? The person in question here is saying that everybody I've described, they've seen in their business life, in and around the many boardroom tables they have sat at. They've seen all the individuals I've just shared with you. I can tell you the number more than that I can share with you are, I keep saying I must actually tape all of these things and just get a book written of the characters that I meet and the challenges that we have to deal with in this environment. Most important when you're dealing with a difficult decision, a difficult person, a difficult desired outcome is, and we've talked about this as well, is to employ your EQ. Work out how are you going to influence that person to get to the right outcome. And going in and punching him on the nose or her on the nose is definitely not going to be a good starting point of that conversation. So how can we get to their level, get to what's important to them, and find a way to deliver what's important another way? It's a very beginning point, is how can you solve their problem in another way? One of the things that I pride myself in is finding a practical solution to something that seems impossible. Mandela had something, a talk of his, was saying, everything's possible, particularly when it's been done. So you can get there. How do you get there? The answer is it can be done. Nelson Mandela said it could, and he did a lot of things we didn't think could be done. So let's get there and let's find a way through it. And sometimes it does take steps and solutions to get through it. The difficult one you have is when the other person is not responding as an adult. When the other person in a difficult people position and you're having to make decisions is behaving like a child, it is going to be really difficult. That becomes a minefield to try and get around when they're not acting peer-to-peer, or they're trying to remain superior to you and putting you into the child position. Very, very difficult then. Okay, question is, depending on what the business is, are we a private equity firm? Are we a PLC listed firm? Are we a family business? Are we an SME chugging along happily? Are we a cash cow position? Are we an SME startup? Are we fintech, digital and flying? Are we global? Companies are all in very different places at every point in their life. It still doesn't change the fundamentals of good governance. The governance detail will be different. It'll be more onerous or more encompassing in different sizes. But the bottom line is we have to do what's right by the company, and we have to work together in an aligned position to achieve it. So the minute we have a people decision that is in the way of those two things, it doesn't make a big difference. PLC CEOs and chairmen walk faster than any other industry. They go regularly every 2 to 3 years. They don't last long. So they have those difficult decisions. They actually get to them and they make them happen. And suddenly somebody says, oh, I've got a sick aunt, or, there's a big story behind it. And you're never going to know what that big story is. And somebody's moved on because that difficult conversation has been had and the person's been given the space to resign. And that's often the best thing to do, is if you can get through a difficult decision where they proactively take it, whatever that might be, and make that decision along the lines of your objective, that is your best outcome, because everybody is not harmed, or nobody is harmed. My English was appalling there. How do you deal with the chair? A situation where the chairman is a large or controlling shareholder, or a family member, or a founder, an original part of the startup part, is the one who's financed the business at the moment, or is part of the PE firm. I can think of all these reasons why that difficult decision has got 10 times more difficult. So there's a couple of things there. Is how do you replace them with the competencies you need? So this person, let's assume, doesn't have the competency to lead that board. They're being disruptive in nature. They're being a bit of a bully. They don't respect governance, and they are not looking forward in a way, or totally bottom line driven all the time. All those kind of things are going wrong. There, what you look for is to bring in a running mate, a new director, that over time you do a transition over from the one to the other. So it becomes a planned action that, because of your role, you are too powerful in your role. You are too important. It's about their ego. They're too important There are better things that we need to be getting on with that you don't have the time for, the governance, the process, the procedures, the discussions. We really would like you as our, you can use titles like presidents and things like that, but actually we would like you to be our specialist advisor. So we will call on you and we'll bring you in, and you do it because that person will have some kind of content. But if you are genuine in that, that can be such an easy way to retain what you need of that person and what they're going to give you, as equally as putting in the right person that needs to do that role. So we're separating the role requirements with the person. And that's the important part I'd like to make to that one, is whenever you're going to do that, is separate the money, separate the shares, separate the relationship, separate what does the role need to get done for this to be successful. The question asked was, do boards feel comfortable to do any form of psychometric testing or DNA testing? Moral DNA as an example. Moral DNA takes you 10, 15 minutes to do. A very good one that I've done with a group of NEDs that I just could not get to work with them. I just was finding them really difficult to engage with. And we all did a EQ test. As a result of the EQ test, it was one way of defining how our points of reference were different. And the minute we got that point, they said, oh, okay, so you think differently. Oh, all right, I can handle that now. And so we could move forward. We had to just do something, anything, didn't matter. But it had to be something outside of the human beings that gave them an evidence thing they could hook their, okay, I can do it differently on. We were able to get people's mindsets to change. So are people happy to do just a straight psychometric test for the sake of it? No. People are not keen on being tested, assessed, analyzed, any of those kind of things. They really, really don't enjoy it. But that, if you're doing it as part of a growth process, of a board development process, as part of a journey of self-development at the same time, people are very curious, very, very curious. They also want to know, so what's he? What's she? What are they? And you can get them through that process to get to engage. So it's got to be very carefully introduced and must be seen as being non-threatening. And the important thing is we have to accept is that is the person. You're not going to change it. Knowing it and understanding it can help you work with it, but it's not a pass-fail. They are not going to be fired because they're a different part of the Myers-Briggs spectrum to you. It's understanding, and I think that's the message you try and get across in that people process, is how much you respect them for who they are, that we want to use better. So that's how I would approach that in that process. Okay, thanks very much, everybody. And it's lovely having this family every Monday lunchtime. Soon we'll have it one evening with a glass of wine to thank you for all your support over the period of time. Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Cheers, Hannah. Cheers, everyone.